Hey everyone, welcome back. In the previous episode, we set up our AppDB context by taking a few baby steps with the counter and the voting poll. We also went ahead and implemented the voting system persistence class from our iVoting system persistence interface. Now, in today's episode, we're going to take a look at the actual voting mechanism. So we're going to dive into our application layer because this is where primarily our interactors are located. And the voting process is a little bit more involved than just creating a vote in the database, right? You need to check that the vote is coming for the correct counter and that the user that has voted isn't going to vote more than once. So this is why it's going to be an interactor process rather than just a record in the database, right? So let's go ahead and start in our voting system application.tests. And here we're going to create our voting interactor tests, right? So this is what we're doing. We're voting. So voting interactor tests.cs. Let's go ahead and bring in our first fact. And here I'm just going to say that a voting interactor is going to save the vote to the database. So we know that there's more logic around it, but we're just going to start with it's going to save it to the database, right? And then we'll add more stuff onto the interactor, like checking if the user has voted before, etc., right? So public void vote, and this is the function name. So vote saves vote, or rather, instead of saves, let's say persists, because we have the persistence layers. Persists vote. Okay, so I'm gonna grab a few things from our voting poll interactor tests, like the iVoting system persistence interface, and I'm gonna put it here. Okay, because this is something that I'm gonna need for my tests, and this is test code, so we're okay with writing this. Next thing, I will need to come up with my interactor, but this I will do during my test. Okay, so let's go ahead and create our interactor. Interactor? Is it It is interactor, or is it interactor? Use your own English language discretion and name it accordingly. Okay, so let's create the voting interactor. Okay. And let's go ahead and generate this class here. We're going to make it public. And I'm going to need to pass the iVoting system persistence interface into it because we're going to be persisting some stuff, okay? Let's grab the object here. And I'm going to need to add this interface in the constructor. I'm going to drop down my Solution Explorer here just so I get a little bit more space. And I'm also going to create this field to be global, okay? So let's go ahead and make a vote, because this is something that it's going to need to save. Okay, and nope, not that. Let's go ahead and generate this vote. Again, I'm going to make this public. And the constructor, I don't really need the constructor here right now. All I want to do now is on my interactor, I want to call vote, and let's pass the vote method and see how Visual Studio fares with generating this method. Okay, close public. Let's make this public. And now I want to go on my mock persistence, and I want to verify that it is indeed trying to persist my vote, right? So I'm going to call save vote. We don't have this function yet, but this is something that we will need, and we will need to pass our vote into here, right? So we're going to make sure that the vote function is going to call save vote function with the vote that we're passing into the vote function, all right? A lot of votes, but this is what we're verifying. So let's go ahead and generate this method. Let's go and check that it's correct. So with the namespace here, let's go ahead and move our vote class into the model layer in our voting system, because that's where the models are going to be living. At the moment we're getting this error because our interface doesn't have a reference to the vote class that we have in our test project, right? So let's go ahead and move this to vote CS. We're going to grab this class and we're going to move it into models here. Okay, and I'm going to change the namespace as well. Okay, so models. Also, all I did is moved the vote class into models here. Okay, and we will have to do the import in our voting interactor tests here as well. Okay, So now that that's working, and we have the verification, let's go ahead and run all of our tests. And you will notice that one thing will break, and that's the voting system persistence, because it's implementing this interface and it has a new function. So we can just implement this interface for now and leave it as not implemented. Okay, let's close that, and again, let's run all of our tests. Okay, so we have a failing test, and this is the failing test that vote persists vote, right? So why is it failing? It's not implemented here in any way, shape, or form. So quick fix, we will go to persistence, and we will call save vote, and we'll pass vote into here. And by the way, you don't have to write into this a red sign every time you're writing these tests. Don't waste your time. Sometimes just go ahead and write it out if you know that that's the solution. You're gonna run the test at some point anyway, and when they fail, they will fail, and you will have to fix them, right? But otherwise, feel free to just write tests as they come. Okay. So we are persisting the vote. What we need to do next is we need to check if a user has voted before on this vote, right? Because who makes the votes? Users make the vote, right? And what do they vote for? They vote for a specific counter. So our vote will need to belong to some kind of counter and will have to come from some specific user. So let's go ahead into here. Let's copy this test and we'll say doesn't persist vote when user already voted. Okay, and the condition for the user already voting will essentially be us checking the database if it has a record of the vote that belongs to the user to that particular counter of the voting poll, right? So the voting poll will need to contain some information around the user. So I will give it a user ID of, let's say, A, or just user, and we will give it a counter ID of 1. Okay, and let's go ahead and generate these two properties. So we'll generate properties, and I'm going to go on the class here. I'm going to make sure that it is generating them correctly. So int and counter ID. Okay, so once I have that on my vote, what I want to do now is grab my mock persistence, and I want to make sure that whatever method that we're going to call to check if this vote already exists will return true. Okay, so let's go to setup, and we're going to say vote exists, and here we're going to pass our vote, and we're going to set it up. And before we set it up, let's go ahead and create this function. So we're going to generate method, and we're going to make sure that this returns a boolean, okay, because this is where we need to check. Does it exist? And we'll return true. So if it exists, we're not allowed to vote. So let's go ahead and return true here. Next thing, we're gonna vote, and here we want to verify that this function with this vote never gets called. So this is where, as the second parameter, we want to pass times and never. So this will never get called. Let's go ahead and run this suite of tests, or we can run all of the tests, but we're gonna again run into the error where it doesn't compile because the interface isn't implemented in the other place. But we'll get there, right? So vote doesn't persist vote when user already voted. So here what we want to do is actually implement this, right? So persistence, let's grab a vote exists for the vote, and if it doesn't exist, let's go ahead and save our vote, right? So let's go ahead and run both of these tests. Okay, so both of them are running. One thing that I want to do is I want to fix this part up to kind of reflect the opposite of this, because we have the user involved. So persists vote when user hasn't voted. Okay, and now the sort of the mandatory, let's go ahead and clean up our tests, right? So same as before, we'll grab a constructor, we'll create our interactor to be global. So let's say private read-only interactor underscore interactor. Let's initialize it from the constructor with our mock persistence object here, and let's remove it from both places. And now we can put the interactor here and here. We can also grab the vote and have it be as a global field. So let's go ahead and copy the interactor field. We'll just replace it with a vote and rename it with a vote as well. And we can just say that it's going to be this buddy right here. Okay, so Now we can remove this. We can supply the vote here and check the vote here, and do the same here essentially. So let's go ahead and put underscores here, here, and here. Okay, and one more thing that I want to do is I want to also put this mock to return false here. I know it already returns false, but I kind of want to crystallize that meaning of this should save it when vote exist returns false. Okay, let's go ahead and run these tests again. Okay, nice. So we're only saving the vote when the vote doesn't exist, which is pretty much what we want. Let's go ahead and run all the tests and run into this build error so we can jump to this file. We will close the other two files now, and we're going to work on implementing these two interfaces, right? So the previous tests kind of gave us the groundwork for us to work on our next tests, right? So let's go ahead and implement the save vote. I'm going to grab this function here, or whoa, did I just delete it all? I did. Let's go ahead and grab it all because it has this kind of transactional scope, so that's what I want. Let's go ahead and delete the poll, and we're gonna delete everything in these transactions. Okay, and let's not forget to rename this test. So persists voting poll. Let's say persists or vote. Persists vote. So what we want to do here in our first transaction, we want to call save vote. And did I accidentally remove the implemented method for vote exists? Okay. So in our first transaction, we want to call save vote, and then we want to check the database that it indeed has this vote that we have saved in the first one, right? So let's go ahead and create the vote. A new vote, and same as before, I'm just going to do user ID will be user, and counter ID will be 1. So let's go ahead and say context, or rather not context, sorry, we will need to grab the iVoting system persistence, or we can just grab this since we already know it implements this interface. So let's grab our persistence, var persistence. Okay, and what we're gonna do is we're gonna call save vote, and we're gonna save our vote. And then in here, we are going to grab our saved vote from the context. So votes, we don't have them, and we know we're gonna grab single, and now you know the whole shingamajig with single, since I showed you it before. But let's go ahead and create votes. I'm gonna go into my app.db context, so I will do this by say app.db context. So what you can do is you can press Ctrl T, and it's kind of like global navigation. So you can say app.db context here and jump to your app.db context. Okay, so in here we can go ahead and grab our vote and create votes. Okay, Ctrl Tab to return to the other menu. Let's go ahead and save this, and let's make sure that the user ID and that the counter ID are equal. Okay, so let's go ahead and say not equals, assert equals. We haven't made it static yet, so we can actually go ahead and create the static import. There is no help for it, so let's go ahead and say static xunit.assert, just like that. Now, can we simplify this? Can we do it in all of our whole file? No. Fix all occurrences in document. Apply. Okay, nice. So now what we want to do, we want to check that the vote dot user ID will equal save vote dot user ID, and we want to check the same for our counter ID. Let's go ahead and run everything. So here's our failing test, and it looks like we have a few failing tests, and this might be because of the name. So let's go ahead and change the name of the database first, and let's go ahead and run this again. Okay, so it looks like it's not failing because of that. Let's go ahead and check the exception. The entity type vote requires a primary key. Okay, so we need a primary key. Let's go to our app.db context, and we're going to do the same thing we did for these two. Let's go ahead and define an ID property for our vote. Okay, so let's go ahead and run everything again. Okay, so only persist vote breaks now, and this is because we haven't actually implemented it. So it's going to be looking real similar to say voting poll, let's go ahead, grab that. Let's put the vote here, and we're going to put it in the votes DB set. And not the type, but the object itself, all right? Or rather, object reference. Right, let's run these tests again. Okay, so both of them pass. Nice. Now what we want to do is we want to check if the vote already exists or not, right? So let's go ahead and grab this test. And now what we want to do first is check that this is going to return false when there is no vote, right? So we don't need to write anything. We will actually keep the vote. So let me bring that back and delete the first transaction, because all we're going to do here is we're going to grab the voting system persistence class. Let's grab the whole persistence, and we're just going to assert true that persistence vote exists, and we're going to pass the vote, and this should return false. So because it doesn't exist, right? We haven't written anything beforehand, and this is what the test is going to test. Vote exists returns false when no vote. Okay, let's go ahead and run this test. Cool. So what we can do is opt in for the simplest solution, right? Just because it's easy and funny to do. We can then copy this, we can run this again and copy this test, right? As you do this more and more, you realize the things you can skip and just do them yourself, right? So let's go ahead, paste this is, returns true when vote exists. Okay, so this is when we're going to grab this transaction, and what we're going to do is we're going to grab our context, and we're going to grab the votes, and we're just going to go ahead and add this vote here. Okay, and we're going to make sure to change the name of the database for both of them, otherwise we know that that can mess everything up. Okay, and we're going to check that this returns true. All right, and we can run this, or rather all the tests. Okay, so that's all the test. This breaks obviously because we just returned false here. So what we can do is we can grab the context, we can grab the votes DB set, we can go ahead and check if there are any votes that where the user ID is equal to the user ID of the vote, or not the comma. I'll say and, not or. It's and, so because it's that specific vote, it's specific to the user and counter. All right, so we need to check the counter ID as well. And counter ID equals vote counter ID. Okay, let's go ahead and run these tests. Okay, this still returns false. I wonder why that is. And that's because we haven't actually saved this transaction. So let's go ahead onto our context, and we can save changes of vote. Just like that. And what we can actually do is call the save changes vote. Nope. What we can actually do is call the what's it called? Save vote on our voting system persistence, right? But that will be kind of like a double check. We don't need that. What if we delete saved vote? We're going to be breaking two tests, not one, right? So this is pretty much passing. So what we're doing here is we are, if I go to the voting interactor tests, we're essentially defining how we're going to be saving this, right? So we're performing a check first, and then we're saving it, and by it I mean the vote, and then we have implemented how it actually is going to be saved in the database. So we created our DB set, and then we implemented the two functions that will either save it or check if this vote already exists, right? So before proceeding into the next episode, let's go ahead and take these parts out and move them into their intended projects. So first of all, let's take care of voting system.database.tests, because this is where the app.db context resides, and it's going to need to go into its own project, which is going to be voting system.database. So let's go ahead and create that. So new project, class library. Let's go ahead and click next. Voting system dot database. Let's go ahead and create this. So this first class, we don't really need it. Let's go ahead and delete it. Let's go ahead and alt enter on the app.db context and not generate constructor, but let's rather move the type into its own class, right? So once the app.db context is here, we can Control X to cut it and Control V to paste it into voting system.database, and we will need to remove the .tests in the namespace here. Now what we want to do is we want to bring an entity framework core into this project. So what I'm going to do is grab voting system.database.tests. I'm going to double click on it to get to my CS project. I'm going to close these properties, and I'm going to cut this line where it says entity framework core. I'm going to leave the in-memory package reference in the project because that's where it will be needed. This is where the in-memory database provider actually is needed, is for your tests, right? So I'm going to grab this. I'm going to go back into my voting system.database project. I'm going to create a item group, and I'm going to paste the package reference here. I'm going to save this. I have actually, let's not click that. I clicked import group, and it should have been item group. So let's go ahead and rename this to item group, and same thing here. Careful not to save your project while this is erroring, because then your project will explode and you will have to go into, you won't be able to load it into Visual Studio, essentially, is what I'm saying. Okay, so let's close these two. What we'll need next is voting system.models. So let's go ahead and import that from our dependencies. Right click, add reference. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add reference to voting system.application, because this is where we'll need the interface voting system persistence, because the database implements that interface. Okay, so let's go ahead and import that, and for this we'll get access to voting system.models as well. Alright, so let's go ahead and close everything, just because we're moving about the projects and it can get confusing, and now we can kind of start fresh. So in voting system.application.tests, this is where we have written our voting interactor tests. So let's go ahead and grab our voting interactor from here and move it into its own project. So again, I'm going to cut Control X voting interactor. I'm going to move it into voting system.application. After moving it, again, I will change its namespace. And let me just make sure that in my voting interactor tests, nothing is breaking, and it's not. Cool. Now what we want to do is do the same thing in the database. So our AppDB context tests, we already moved our AppDB context away from here. And by the way, we haven't added the voting class into these tests. And as I mentioned before, these were kind of foot in the door tests. So if you feel like you need to add a test for that here, go ahead and do that. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go into my voting system persistent tests, and I'm going to grab the implementation for the interface here. And this is actually breaking, so let's move this type out. Voting system persistence, I'm going to cut it, and I'm going to put it in the database layer. And I'm going to go in here, I'm going to just change the namespace. So I'm going to remove .tests from here. Okay, so in voting system persistent tests, it looks like it's actually breaking because we need to... okay, so we don't actually have references in here. Let's close everything again, because having too many files confuses things. So in our voting system persistence tests, we don't have a reference to voting system persistence. As we know, if we look into our dependencies and the project, we only have the reference to voting system.application. The stuff that we have implemented in voting system.database isn't actually referenced here. So this is where we can double click and go into the CS project file, and we can change the voting system.application to database here and save that. And now the reference should change, and we should see this type come in or not. It looks like it can't find it. Maybe let's do .NET Restore. Or this project just flat out doesn't exist and I have misspelled it. So let's go ahead and grab the reference this way. I'm not sure what the difference will be. I might have... Oh, okay, so you can see how I misspelled it with the CS, not only the CS project file, but also the path before it. So let's go ahead and remove the top one. Let's make sure everything builds. So now that everything builds, we can actually go ahead and run over all of our tests, and we can make sure that everything that we have moved around hasn't broken any functionality. Okay, and you can see that our program still works. This will be it for this episode. If you enjoyed it, leave a like, subscribe. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments section. Don't forget to join the Discord channel. And as always, I'll see you in the next episode.